Welcome back to Get Down to Business, the show all about small business jobs and entrepreneurship. And speaking about small business, I am thrilled to be joined by David Borris, small business owner for many years, very involved actively in leadership of the Main Street Alliance, a national business network. David, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Shalom. I'm so happy to be here. Appreciate it.
It's great to have you. And for those that haven't heard your name before, you've been the owner of Hell's Kitchen Catering based in, I believe, in Northbrook. Is that correct?
Correct. For 34 years. Hell's Kitchen is still in business. I'm just not the owner any longer.
That just means you have less stress and you're able to be actively involved in so many other things, which we're going to talk about. But I love to get to know the person behind the microphone. David, for our listeners, do you mind telling everybody a little bit about yourself?
Well, sure. Hell's Kitchen, myself and my wife, Carrie, started the business 35 years ago now. It was really kind of the American dream, right? I mean, we scraped together a little bit of money. Was fortunate enough to have a father and a father-in-law who were willing to co-sign a note. And we got started in 900 square feet in downtown Highland Park. And believe me, the first 18 months into the business, when I had left, a career track in hospitality in the corporate world, and I thought, why am I mopping the floor? Why am I working 17-hour days? My wife as well. And then we expanded 4 years later. We expanded 8 years after that, and it all worked out quite well. When we sold it, we had 37 full-time employees, over 80 part-time and seasonal workers, and it was good for us.
Absolutely. And David, you have been very actively involved, as I mentioned earlier, the Main Street Alliance, but in particular, when somebody looks you up, and we'll make sure that folks know where they can find you, that you very often many folks will see that you testified in front of the Small Business Committee in the United States Congress, and you have been an advocate for workers. And that is something I want to bring it back to Hell's Kitchen. Throughout your time in small business, it sounds like your employees were sort of really the business that you were in. Yes, you were in catering, but you learned a lot about people. Do you mind telling our listeners a little bit about that?
Well, I think that the two things go together. And when you talk about how we, watch out for workers, we watch out for workers, before we had to. We certainly provided health care for our employees early on in our business because we thought it was simply the right thing to do. They're part of our family. The other thing that I thought was really important, and I was in D.C. a couple of times talking about raising wages. And that isn't really, that's a moral conversation at its core, but really at its core for small business, raising wages is a conversation about aggregate demand. Right? 70% of our economy is consumer spending. And if there is not enough money in the pockets of consumers, then we're not in business. And my employees are my neighbor business's customers, and his employees are my customers. And seeing a virtuous cycle of rising wages, job creation, and profitability is how we kind of view the small business economy.
Absolutely. And I'm chatting with David Borris, the longtime owner of Hell's Kitchen Catering in Northbrook. David now is continuing his advocacy around businesses. You were just hearing talking about wages, but also, David, you have been a very strong advocate from the business perspective, really from all perspectives, for the fair tax in Illinois. And we're going to continue talking about that. But David, how did you come around to supporting the official, folks can probably have received in the mail, the official fair tax ballot language, but how did you come around to supporting this initiative?
Well, I think we've understood for a long time, right, that Illinois has sort of been digging themselves a hole for quite some time. That's a bipartisan hole that's been dug. And so you start to look several years ago at how do you really get out of this, right? How do we solve the structural debt problem in Illinois? At the same time, we start to look at where the income's been going, right? As the economy produces greater returns for the overall economy, in Illinois in particular, as well as across the country, where does the money wind up? And when I look at my income, it's a funny story. They asked Warren Buffett, I think, a couple of years ago. They said, well, doesn't it bother you when they talk about class war? And he said, well, no, it is a war, and my class is winning, right? And so I think there's an important conversation here about what happens when a modern economy distributes the riches of that economy in a very, very unequal way. Well, we start to look at what I think, if you'll let me invoke a quote here for a moment, what the father of modern capitalism said about how taxation is supposed to work. Adam Smith, in 1776, when he wrote The Wealth of Nations, said, and if you'll indulge me for a moment, the subjects of every state ought to contribute toward the support of the government as nearly as possible in proportion to their respective abilities. That is, in proportion to the revenue which they respectively enjoy under the protection of the state. A goal of taxation should be to remedy inequality of riches as much as possible by relieving the poor and burdening the rich. So I think that it became obvious and evident that if we want to leave the most money in the pocket.
David, I'm just going to have to cut you off real quick because we're going to squeeze in a quick break, but we're going to continue our conversation with David Borris, a longtime business owner and advocate for the fair tax, when we come back after this quick break. We are back on Get Down to Business and continuing our conversation with David Borris, the longtime owner of Hell's Kitchen Catering and member of the Main Street Alliance's National Executive Committee. David, we were just talking about the fair tax and what you were talking about in your experience in business, in your many years owning Hell's Kitchen Catering, is you talked about your focus on people. And it sounds like a lot of that brought you to support of the fair tax, which is candidly a very controversial issue in this upcoming election. So David, what have you been hearing on, I guess, bluntly, Main Street? What are you hearing from folks as we prepare just a couple of weeks away from the upcoming election?
So I think we're hearing some things that are legitimate concerns to be taken up, in my opinion, after we pass the fair tax. I don't think there's any question when you look at the actual numbers that the fair tax needs to happen. We need to get to a graduated tax system. And I'm not going to go through all the numbers with all the other states and how it works in other states and how effective it's been and what it meant to California and what it meant to Minnesota. Those are just bald-faced facts. I do think, though, there is a deep concern with people saying, Springfield seems to have screwed it up for a number of years. 30 or 40 years we spent digging this hole. Why should I trust them to get it right now? And I think that's a really hard question to answer, but I do think the simplest answer is it's us. It's business owners. It's the electorate, not at this moment to say, let's throw out the baby with the bathwater. Let's not pass good legislation because we don't really trust those guys down there. I think we pass the legislation. And then what I've been advocating to people is you make certain that you get on a telephone Zoom meeting or a phone call with your state rep, with your state senator within 5 weeks after the election and say, okay, we gave you the money. I want to talk about this budget. I need to be more involved. I need to know more. And I know a lot of people will sit and say, look, I got a family to raise, I got a business to run. I don't have time to be involved. But you know what? This is our lives. And we certainly have to take the time to be more involved in holding our state representatives' feet to the fire to do the things that we know they need to do. And I think that's the concern. People are uneasy. I've talked to dozens of people who say to me, I know it's the right thing to do, but God, I just don't like trusting those guys down there. My question is, what are you going to do if you don't pass it? You're going to trust them to get it right without the ability to put the taxes in a modern economy where they belong? It's a train wreck if you don't
David,
pass
I
it.
want to talk about advocacy, which is a perfect segue from our conversation about the fair tax. Because that is something that I love your point, regardless of what side people fall on this particular issue, regardless what side people fall into in the presidential election or any other election that's taking place. Your strong message is advocacy. So, David, you know a thing or two about being busy. You ran a successful business. You've been busy in your personal and professional life. So tell us a little bit about your advocacy and when you sort of fell in love with the idea of being actively involved and making a difference, because I hear it in your voice. That is something that I know you want to encourage everybody, regardless of where on the aisle they might fall.
Sure. Well, my advocacy as a business owner really started because I was in such a state of pain paying crazy wild healthcare premiums, right? So I got involved in 2008 with Healthcare for America Now, working with a couple of different organizations in the state of Illinois, and then wound up working on the national level and wound up testifying in front of Ways and Means, and you had mentioned Small Business Committee and other things. So it really started because healthcare premiums were absolutely out of control, and there was no way to really understand them. Now, some people will say that we still have a problem with healthcare. Yes, we certainly do. But I felt good about the beginning of that work. And that's really what got me interested in understanding how important it is that there's a small business voice that is not represented by the NFIB and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. You know, there's a difference. We kind of get this idea, and your show is probably a great place to talk about this, that there's a monolithic business voice. There's not a monolithic business voice. Big, huge corporations have a different agenda, right? And they look for different things than small businesses do. We're looking at aggregate demand. We're looking at making certain that money doesn't get sucked out of our communities, that money stays in our communities to circulate. I think that's a giant difference.
Absolutely. I've been chatting with David Borris, an advocate for the fair tax amendment, and your upcoming, many of us have already voted, but if you're going out to vote, you certainly will see it on your ballot, and it is important to pay attention to every race. As David was just saying, advocacy and elections do matter. David, I know people can learn more about the fair tax by visiting voteyesforfairness.com, and of course, researching the issue. Researching the issue is very important. But David, is there anywhere else where you would like to send our listeners where they can learn more about your business advocacy and everything else you've been involved in?
They can certainly go to mainstreetalliance.org. There's a tremendous amount of work we've been doing on trying to get a little more help to small businesses in pandemic relief. We're at a critical tipping point right now. I think that what happened early on, the first CARES Act was fantastic. I think there are businesses just hanging on by their fingernails. And if we can give them a little more push, a little more help to get over the vaccine hump until next April or May, that we can save millions of jobs. Well,
David, we're going to have to leave it there. I appreciate your advocacy, your voice, mainstreetalliance.org. Vote yes for fairness. We'll be joined by Dr. Jim White in just a moment.